Everyone, hello and welcome to our session on building bridges between science and urban policy. My name is Marie-Christine Terrien. I'm a professor at the National School of Public Administration here in Montreal. We prepared this session and we're hoping to engage you in conversations on solutions to build bridges between science and urban public policy. With an interactive concept mapping exercise conducted by you and the participants on the parallel. So I am desperately trying to do my screen. Hold on a second. Here, I will share my screen. And if someone can confirm that I am sharing my screen. Will you be able to do that? This way? I was. Let me try again. How are we doing now? Good. Thank you. Apologies for that. Technical issues. Good. Before we do anything, I want to acknowledge that we're gathering virtually on unceded territory across Turtle Island because we have people from many areas of Canada. So let me begin by acknowledging that we're meeting virtually across Turtle Island, land that has been inhabited by Indigenous people for thousands of years. So let me start with introducing and having them introduce themselves, our great panelists that will tell us successful science to urban policy and what it looks like. So what we'll do first is have them introduce themselves, 2 minutes each. So it's a go. Jenny, how about we hear from you?
Okay, sounds great. Thank you so much. My name is Jenny Matthews-Tussu. I work for the City of Calgary, and I am the program lead for Inclusive Futures with Resilience. I specifically look at how institutions of power build trusting and informed relationships with equity-deserving communities. So that's my primary job. I'm also an instructor of social policy at the University of Calgary. I teach both at a master's level and at a bachelor's level. And my goal is to really inspire policymakers to build socially responsible cities. And so it's kind of my jam of sorts. And so a lot of the work that I do is right now, especially at the City of Calgary, is looking at how do we build futures readiness in equity deserving communities so that one, that they are better prepared for the many disruptions that we seem to be facing here kind of globally and nationally and locally. So how can they be prepared for those type of those disruptions, but also how do we look at creating agency, or I hate that word creating, but thinking about agency. So how can equity deserving communities build the futures that they want, right? So that futures aren't imposed on them, that they look at how they can be involved meaningfully in creating the futures, their preferred futures. And so that's a little bit about who I am. So thank you very much.
That's great, Jenny. Thank you so much. Our next panelist, David, how about you?
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. My name is David Walksmith, and I am an associate professor in the School of Urban Planning at McGill University. I'm also the Canada Research Chair in Urban Governance. And, I'm an academic. I study local politics. And, In particular, at McGill, I direct the Urban Politics and Governance Research Group, where with a team of other researchers, we are trying to investigate kind of the tricky urban governance challenges that really kind of bleed over the border of individual cities, that force us as researchers, force policymakers to think about interconnections between different cities, whether that's through cooperation or through competition, and kind of the way that bigger picture questions kind of arrive in the arenas of local politics. So some of that work has involved questions of local economic development policy, where cities are increasingly kind of understanding that in order to be competitive globally, they may need to be cooperative more regionally. That's involved work on sustainability planning and policy, because as you know, the challenges of climate change, but also other environmental risks and environmental events, they just don't respect the borders that we have drawn on our maps, and kind of require responses from policymakers that also kind of work past those borders. And then finally, I've done a lot of work increasingly, been the focus of my research in the last several years on housing policy and on how globalization is changing local housing markets. And so, kind of one big example there is the emergence of short-term rental platforms like Airbnb, which kind of put, the global marketplace of tourists into competition with local residents for housing. So, I'm a researcher. My job is to teach and to produce research. But over the last several years, I've been increasingly involved in helping local policymakers think through aspects of housing policy, particularly in the arena of short-term rentals, and really see my role as trying to provide a kind of bedrock of empirical information and kind of sound that we can have the political process kind of on top of, and something I'm going to be excited to explore with you over the course of this panel.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. And our next panelist, Julie.
Yes, thank you, Marie-Christine. Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today. So I'm Julie Da Silva. I'm a higher education advisor in the Economic Development Department at the City of Montreal. So in 2019, I contributed to the launch and development of Le Carrefour de la Recherche Urbaine de Montréal. It's a municipal urban research hub. Before that, I worked for 14 years in a university as a research advisor, so I know a bit about research in the universities. But let's talk about a bit more what I do in the City of Montreal. So the hub we have set up aims to play this role by offering support to the departments and the boroughs of the City of Montreal, as well to all higher education institutions that are interested in implementing research projects. It creates networking opportunities and practice sharing activities between the city and higher education institutions intended to encourage and promote the transfer of knowledge, practices, and research results. So mainly we support the city, departments and boroughs in the development and monitoring of premises research projects. So we do concrete research projects with everybody. We initiate networking and engagement activities between the city, higher education institution, and all the innovation ecosystem. And we also promote knowledge transfer. That's really important for us, and the use of research results. So mainly that's what we do. And maybe I will have the chance to explain a bit more later by concrete examples.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you to all three. And we're going to create a bit of anticipation here in this panel, because what we're going to ask is that the panelists, as you, engage with us in an exercise that's called concept mapping. So we wanted this session to be a little more interactive, and we will hear a lot more from our panelists. So this is why I'm saying that we're creating anticipation. So what we want to do with you is an exercise that's called concept mapping. So concept mapping is recognized as a method with 3 parts. And we will be doing 2 of these parts together today. The first part consists of a brainstorming of ideas around a broad question. The second part is what we call in this exercise, organizing a selection of ideas by the participants during that were done by the participants during a first part. And finally, we do an interpretation by looking at a map together where we interpret all of these ideas that are being regrouped. So the result will be a concept map of your ideas organized around the way that you think this question of improving the link between science and public policy, or urban public policy, I should say, is organized. And this map will be used to guide actions to better link research and practice for the future of cities. So how does it work? Well, last week, we had people answer this question. In your opinion, to strengthen the link between science and urban public policy, we should have, and people gave ideas. So this was done with colleagues and different panelists and the public to share what their answers were on this question. So we have all this bulk of answers. And now today we will be making groups with a selection of these ideas shared by the public. So let me just again explain this, what we're asking you to do to participate with us and be very generous in your time in regrouping of ideas. So we will ask you, we will show you, and we will put in the chat a link where you will go and group items based on what makes sense to you to regroup. Then my colleague, who is co-directing the Collaboratoire Unicité, which is working on urban science to policy, will come to present the results at the end of the panel, and we can interpret the map together, and we'll have our panelists interpret the map with you. So what we're going to do is you're going to follow the link in the chat. You're going to read the consent form, and you're going to answer 2 intro questions. You can read and group the items together, and then submit your responses and sit back and relax and enjoy the panel, and we will come back with a concept mapping after. So just to let you know, we have a group of different people in the background analyzing all this. So once you get onto the platform that we've sent to you with the link, you'll see that there's many different ideas out there. And so this is an example of things that you will see. So for example, you'll see answers that were given in the first phase, which I explained previously. Example, bridging structures that are dedicated to facilitate the dialogue, reflection, co-construction of projects between scientific and urban policy experts. Another idea was training for elected officials to link between science and urban policy. So we will ask you in the first part, when you join the link, to read these different items. And then what we're going to ask you to do is we're going to ask you to regroup them. So to do so, the instructions are the following. You will click on an item and you drag and drop it onto another related item to create a group. So meaning that these 2 ideas you think go together, okay? And you name each of your groups. 4 things to keep in mind. You can create as many groups as you want. You can drag and drop as many items as you wish into a group. And you, to create a group, you need to have at least 2 items. And you must create at least 1 group to continue. Once you're happy with all of the sorting that you've done, you click on Next to submit your questionnaire. And you will have some time to do this. So what we've thought of doing to give you some time is to actually put a hold on the panel for a quick 5 to 7 minutes where we will let you go and click on the link, do the concept mapping. So we will be in silence for 5 to 7 minutes. And as soon as we're ready to go, I will come back up on the air, and we will have the discussion, the presentation and the discussion with our panelists. Very good. So I will stop my share screen, and we can have this done. If you have any questions, please do use the chat, where someone is ready to answer questions for you in anything that could come up as a question. And good luck and good work. Yeah, so the problem is that when I share my screen, the only thing I see is my PowerPoint. Now I'm sharing my screen and I'm not seeing anything on the main stage, and says the session will start soon. So I need your help. Thank you. Good. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So time's up. We are going to go back on track with our great panelists. So what we've asked our panelists to do is give us a rapid round, each 3 actions for better science to urban policy linkages. Top top 2 minutes for everybody. So Jenny, let's hear about you first.
So hoping I'd be going last.
There you go.
Anyway, okay. Yeah, I got 2 minutes, so let's see how I do. Okay, so I have kind of 3 messages when it comes to linking science and urban policy. And the first one I have to say is probably the first 2 that I'm going to talk about are related to knowledge transfer, right? It's really key. And so when I think about when we're trying to do that link, I think sometimes we forget about our audience. And so when we're trying to explain the science and how it should inform decision-making, many times when I think about our decision makers, so I'm thinking about people on city council, I'm thinking about people possibly in senior leadership roles or in management roles at a city government. What I've learned or what I've noticed is, the last time that they've probably taken science or, have even thought about science is probably when they were in grade 10. Right? You probably took a high school class, right? Because you're supposed to, in science, most likely in grade 10. So think about it, that they were probably 16 years old the last time they took a science class. And so we have to think about the language that we use, right? To think about, academic knowledge, while it makes us look really smart, the fact of the matter is that most decision makers have no idea what we're talking about. So this is one big disconnect, is that the fact is that we have to be thinking about kind of how we communicate our information in such a way that we are speaking to people, as I said, who haven't taken science since they were 16. So we're talking about 30, 40 years ago. And so I think that's really important, right? And so that's the first message I want to talk about. The second one is that, academic knowledge in general, even for those, like even for myself who took my master's is in science as well, more often than not, the language isn't accessible. It's not relatable. It's not understandable. Like one of the examples I can use, I'm involved with a project with UNESCO right now, and we did an invitation for a community to be involved in a futures literacy lab. And the language was so academic that nobody in the co-design team that I have, as well as the community, understood what was going on. So as a person like myself, who's seemingly knowledgeable, I had struggled with the information that we were providing to community to be involved in a futures literacy lab, to think about how we're going to make changes. If I couldn't understand it, you can guarantee that more people are not. So thinking about like storytelling, thinking about infographics, like how do we take 10, 20, 30 pages of information and bring it down to like 1 page? It's one of the lessons that I have with my policy classes, is that I make them do policy analysis, and they have to present it to me on 1 page. And it's because decision makers don't want to read anything more than 1 or 2 pages. And so how are we sending or giving them messages in short, simple ways that actually says a lot? And so, how do we condense that down to, like I said, 1 or 2 pages? And then the third thing I want to say is that I want us to also think about different kinds of information. I'm not going to call it research, but different kinds of information that we could be thinking about to inform decision-making when it comes to urban policy. So I know traditionally we do our scans, right? Our research scans. We look at, quote, best practice, and I could be ranting about that for a while, but I won't. But like just saying that a lot of times we think that that's what we should be thinking about when it comes to urban policy. And I would argue, especially in the spaces that I've been in futures thinking, futures literacy, we need to start also thinking about information that's happening in the margins, right? They call them signals in futures thinking, or the provocations, and how if those initiatives, those things that are happening in the margins actually become mainstream, how does that actually impact what's going on in our cities? And so how can that impact policy, and how can we pivot in policy that's responsive to those possible future trends, future movements that could be happening. And so we need to start paying attention to not just research of the current or what's happening in the past, but we also need to start scanning what's happening in the margins, because that could be really truly influencing our future. So I would say that those are probably my three messages or key messages that I want to share today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jenny. David, how about you? 3 actions.
All right. I've got 3. The first is, I guess they're all pretty much focused on what's going on on the researcher side of this. That's where I'm coming from. I think we should have dedicated policy and media training for researchers that exists kind of like co-equally with the dedicated research training that we get. So I think it's not realistic that PhD programs are going to spend an equal amount of time training people how to communicate with policymakers as they are training people how to become academics. But the fact remains that systematically, graduate programs, they prepare you to do a big portion of the work of being a researcher. And if we think of communicating with policymakers and kind of being part of the policymaking process as an important thing, we're really failing to incorporate that properly into graduate training. People who want to do policy relevant or policy facing work as academics, you have to kind of freelance. You have to figure that out on your own. I think we could kind of incorporate that better into the structure of academic education. Second, I think there should, it would be probably pretty high cost benefit ratio to have more federal and provincial grant making for researchers geared towards projects which have either a kind of direct policy connection or a kind of public communication connection. Because fundamentally, academics, we do the research that we get funded to do. And if what we get funded to do, if there are opportunities for people who are interested in kind of touching, kind of being involved with policymaking that don't end up being a kind of a zero-sum drain on your kind of core research time, that's going to improve outcomes. And then third, I think we can learn from areas that do this well. In particular, the areas of what I'm thinking of urban policymaking that kind of routinely incorporate research into policy development. One example, this might be like local transport policy. I think it's very routine in that area for big investment decisions to engage academics quite substantively in terms of modeling, in terms of scenarios. And I think there's a kind of like a lot of knowledge that's already latent here that really just needs to be kind of spread more widely. That's my thought.
Great, wonderful, thank you. Julie, how about you?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say that I agree with everything that has been said by David and Jenny. And from a city point of view, I will add 3 things, well, maybe 2. The first one is to formalize relationships between the research community and cities. So I think it's really important. It's fundamental in developing agile, sustainable, and responsible structures and mechanism within the cities that integrate and facilitate the transformation from science into practice on a daily basis. So I think this kind of structures can help. It is also really important that the proposed structures or mechanism can withstand changes in administrations. We must not turn them also into political instruments, but ensure they are independent and neutral. So that's the first point. And that's why in the City of Montreal, we have created the hub. The second point I will present is I think it's really important to develop a real scientific culture in cities. So it's not yet the case everywhere. So cities must develop a scientific reflex, and this will permit the establishment of a scientific culture in all instances. We must science must be made more understandable by both decision makers and also citizens. And we must be able to explain the limits of science, how it works, but above all, why it is so important for better decision making. So it's also a matter of trust, I think. If policies are consistent, then citizens will trust science and politics better. So at the City of Montreal, for example, we started offering scientific advice workshops to the elected people, so that helps to understand more science. And the third point I will present, I agree with Jenny, and it's something similar. So I think we have to develop a common language. Science and municipal politics constitute two different and complex universes where the actors have different languages and a distinct way of functioning. So to facilitate the emergence of solutions based on science that are anchored in the political and social context surrounding the decision making, all parties must build a common ground, making it possible to reconcile two realities, that of science and that of municipal politics. So for that, at the city, we developed an initiative called Série Montréal, and this aims to bring together researchers and representatives of departments and boroughs around an issue affecting the city. So via conferences, booths, and B2B meetings, researchers and the city representatives have the opportunity to exchange their knowledge and experiences in order to identify possible solutions.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you again, all three. I mean, these ideas that you set the ground for our discussions are amazing and very complete, and we see that there's many things to discuss, which we will do very, very, very shortly. So for everybody that's listening, time's up. We've closed the grouping, and thank you for working with us. So the team is going to be working in the background and looking at creating and analyzing the data over the next half hour. So again, we hope to create anticipation and look forward to having and showing you the results very, very shortly. So thank you again for doing all this work. So back to our panelists. The first question I want to ask you, and using what you've just set the table for, and looking at how these elements can be probably mobilized, or have already been mobilized or should be mobilized, I guess is, how can we move beyond pilot projects, which we very often see, or specific intervention research mandates, to a full science to policy approach, and develop that so that it's more ingrained, I guess, in the sphere between researchers and cities. So who wants to have a go at it first, and we can get this conversation going?
Well, I can go.
Great, Julie. Yes, please.
So I think successful science integration into urban policy is possible when either civil servants and elected officials are able to continuously use and incorporate scientific results into decision-making processes. So to do that, I think one thing is really important is to co-construct. So sometimes we see researchers just giving reports and that's it, but we really have to co-construct and not simply plus some science. So create a real partnership from the beginning to the end. It's really important, and involve also the stakeholders in the projects. So this assumes that the researchers has a good understanding of the problem and the needs of the city, and that he is involved in all stages of the process, permitting the development of a solution or a public policy that's really responds to the city. So we must agree also to go back and forth to optimize the results, even if it takes time. So for example, I like the format of a research share. At the City of Montreal, we finance 6 research share, and it really helps the construction of good solutions and public policy. So maybe just a bit on stakeholders. So I think it's really important to involve them, citizens, businesses, community organizations, because they will help the constructions of the solutions. And they will have an impact on the effectiveness of the new public policy or the solution we will find. So that's what I want to say.
Yeah, and that's a great way to introduce these different items of this, the sort of ongoing process going back and forth, and stakeholder, all of the different types of stakeholders seems to be very central in the discussions between science to policy in general also. So, Jenny, David, what's your take on that?
I mean, one thing I can say is that I think that people in kind of in the different, like, people in academia, people in municipal administrations, like, we all are kind of putting out the fires that we are able to put out, and kind of working within the the kind of let's say, like, the shorter term constraints of our jobs, in a way that I think really that really facilitates the kind of pilot project or one-off report style of communication, right? Because on the policymaking end, like, you've got certainly in the kind of the areas that I've been that I've had some engagement with, there's an issue because the mayor's office asked for something, or that they're kind of like, staff is responding to political demands, and then they need to like fulfill those political demands, and so they get in touch with me and say, could you answer this question for us? And that works well for me also, because I can say, yes, I can slot that in, I have a grad student, we'll put them on, and 3 months from now we'll give you a report. And if we want that system to look different, I mean, the thing that Julie mentioned about having like research chairs embedded in the city, like those ideas that actually kind of break up the routine kind of flow of how this kind of science policy communication works, I feel like are completely are vital. Probably you can't do it without some of those kinds of facilitating structures, because at the end of the day, like there are, like, if there aren't kind of changes to like basically like the rules of how everybody kind of engages professionally in with the kind of science policy making flow, then what happens is we'll get kind of reasonable outcomes that fit with our kind of like inherited set of priorities and restrictions and the rest of that. So you got to change what those kind of underlying priorities look like. I thought the rapid fire round suggests at least a couple of ways that would work, but again, maybe just to stress one of them on the academic end, our system of kind of like of basically of kind of professional advancement, promotion, but also like in particular the kind of the research funding system, which comes from the federal government and the provincial government, certainly here in Quebec as well. We respond to what opportunities are available there, and that really drives a whole lot of how academics kind of put together their research plans. If some of those opportunities encourage as opposed to discourage, which I think is the current situation, like robust, long-term, ongoing policy engagement, we'll see different, academics make different choices. And if we don't see those systems change, I don't think we will see people make different choices.
Yes, and I guess the timing is also very central in this, where the way that public policy is made in cities. We have to also have sort of an alignment where their time is very often much shorter than the researchers' time to create this. So great. Jenny, what's your take on this?
Yeah, great information from David and from Julia. Like I was really reflecting on what Julie was saying about co-designing. And so I agree. I couldn't agree more. And sometimes when I think about how we co-create policy, right, and we want to be able to ensure that we do have different groups of people around the table. And it can't be just your token people. It can't be your one person that represents the university and just have one person that represents the city and one person. You really do need to think about how to make that a little bit more robust. But What I also want to say is that when you co-design, you really, especially when it comes to urban policy, I always think about who is impacted by that policy and who can impact the outcomes of that policy. And those are the individuals actually that need to be at the table, not just a general research chair. I really do think that we need to think really intentionally about whatever. So if it's, about transit, or if it's about, social policies, for instance, we really need to sit and think, okay, who can impact the outcomes of that policy? Okay, well, those are the business units, those are the individuals from the city, for instance, that need to be at the table. Same thing with the university, but also when we think about the private sector, when we think about the not-for-profit sector, when we think about community groups that are actually impacted by that policy, they need to be at the table too. And it can't be something that you just kind of create some policy, some paper, and then ask for their input afterwards. What I've learned from experience, and I've done this work for a long time, what I've learned from experience is I've done the first where I've just kind of created it, and then I showed people and they're like, no, Jenny, this isn't going to work for us, right? And it shuts down. And so when it comes to policy, it's about relationships, right? And so if you truly want to build relationships between the different community groups and stakeholders, you need to take time. I mean, it's unfortunate, but we do need to take time, but it's not just for that one policy. We need to be building relationships throughout. And then if they're part of it from the beginning, they're actually identifying what the research questions are, or the policy questions are, or what are the gaps in policy right from the start. And then they are actually involved. And so we're, embedding equity, we're embedding those kind of processes throughout the policy change or the development of the policy. What I have seen is far more engagement, far more involvement, approval. They want to get involved afterwards. So it's more than a pilot project, right? They actually want to be more involved. And that's been my experience. The other thing is when we think about who we're involving, make sure it's not all the people who think the same way you do, right? So I know that we believe that we're unbiased in terms of how we do our research. And I would argue, okay, well, not 100% clear about that or believe in that. But I do think you need different ideologies, different values around the table, because governments change, right? Our city council right now in Calgary, we've just gone through a new city council. We need to be thinking about how do you involve people with different ideologies and different interests in that. And so they will support the process beyond the pilot. And and it will become more sustainable. Anyway, so those are some of my comments that I have about that question.
Great. And, in thinking what you're saying of involving more of the stakeholders, it also comes to what I think David was also mentioning and is part of also what Julie talked about in her introductory remarks. And I'm thinking, Julie, because you have, a specific unit at the City of Montreal, how is it that either the unit that you have, the CRUM, or in storing what you were saying also of a culture, a scientific culture in the city. How is it that bringing in many different stakeholders and actually hitting the ground running doing this is do you think is possible? How have you had any experiences with the unit where this can actually, be seen and done and what you're seeing with it?
Yes, we did. We support a lot of services that wants to do research projects, and what we see is, I agree with Jenny. We have to have discussion before we plan something, and we prepare what we want to do together. So that's advices we give to the cities and the researchers. So we have seen that it's really important to take this time of discussion to make sure everyone understands what we are going to do together. So sometimes we want to go fast and it doesn't work. So we have to be sure that the roles are clear. For example, who's going to bring the data? Who's going to bring the cash to do the project? Who's going to bring the in-kind contribution? So these discussions are fundamental, and sometimes we want to skip it, and it won't be good for the realization of a project. So I think that the notion of time is really important. And you said before that cities have a pace of time is different than researchers, and we have to conceal this. So we in cities we have authorities that has to approve budgets and everything, and sometimes it's difficult for the researchers to understand that, and sometimes the researchers wants to go fast because there is an opportunity with a grant and everything, and he is coming to the city and saying, "Oh, can you just give your approbation on this letter of intent?" But it's too late. So we really have to take this time before the project to be sure that everything is will be fine to develop a good solution.
Mm. Yeah. And David, how about any takes on this, on how you you see this happening from the researcher, I guess, side of it?
Having been in exactly the situation that Julia just described, I mean, I think it's challenging, like that there are, everybody's working on their own timelines, and that's why I was, before kind of stressing that, like, I think that there are probably like interesting practical like questions about in the kind of in the near term how we can kind of tweak these kinds of forms of engagement, but that at the end of the day, like some of these challenges are really kind of deeply rooted in in our kind of respective institutions, and so that, which isn't to say that academics can't send our letters of intent to the city sooner rather than we do. I mean but at the end of the day, like these things the like a lot of the stuff that's coming up from academia, from researchers, it's really driven by a certain kind of time cycle related to SSHRC and NSERC and the FRQ, and that, like that, and that's life, right? And so that and the flip side of that is that I have certainly had folks at various municipal governments in Canada reach out in ways where that, again, kind of reflecting, like, in particular, I think, kind of political timelines, and in ways that I would have loved to have been able to help, but fundamentally it was like, well, I've got a grad student who could work on this in the summer, but they need an answer in March. So it's like, and it's too bad. Like, so I feel like but those things kind of flow out of, like, they're not just kind of people making mistakes. They're like reflections of actually like different kind of like temporalities, as we would say, right, for how people are doing this work. And so so this is why kind of I keep coming back to the idea of figuring out places to kind of start building different kinds of structures that work on more collaborative ideas of timelines, but that's hard to do, and that's not a kind of like, we're not going to nail that down in in 2022 exactly.
Or in our full panel here. But we are asking great questions and getting this along. So let me just tell the audience that if you have any questions for the panelists, we will be taking them very soon, so that we can have them answer and look at these different questions and see what they take on it. So let's maybe look at another area, or very closely to this area of urban to or science to urban policy. Looking more into scientific evidence. How is it that scientific evidence can inform not only the context and planning, but the implementation of urban transformation? So I call it going through the glass ceiling, that we actually go for a full transformation. So any ideas on that?
You could hop on that one, just because I feel like that this is I've thought a lot about, and kind of and maybe just kind of like briefly via an anecdote or two. When 3 or 4 years ago, it was about when I started working with municipalities on short-term rental issues, like Airbnb. this kind of emerging big problem for housing planning, because up until the last couple of years, municipalities, their planning departments, the housing departments, you kind of know what you're dealing with in terms of the existing housing stock, and you can kind of see what's getting built and what's getting converted, and then suddenly there was this potentially big deal where a lot of homes, like apartment buildings in particular and condos in our big cities, were not being used as housing anymore, and so that I think policymakers were aware of this, but they were also getting a lot of complaints from residents who were saying, I don't like that there's a party happening next door. And what was very clear to me at the kind of outset of this work a couple of years ago is that there was a kind of like political process kind of gathering steam in many different municipalities, including here in Montreal, but really across the world, that was gathering steam with no evidence at all, basically, or let's say no systematic evidence of the kind that I would want to see, right? And this is it's totally understandable and inevitable this would happen, because on the one hand, you're getting all these complaints. I live in the borough. I live in Montreal, Le Plateau, Montréal. The mayor of the borough at one point remarked that the issue that generated the most complaints to the borough mayor's office was Airbnb. So in that context, of course, policy is going to happen, right? But what made this an interesting situation was that nobody knew anything about it. It was all kind of, suspicion and supposition. And of course, there weren't any existing municipal laws to deal with this in most cases. And so what I found, what ended up happening is, because I was doing some research, just trying to kind of, frankly, just add up some numbers and figure out what the scale of this issue was in different cities, it turned out that was really useful. Since then we've kind of graduated to more sophisticated forms of analysis, but literally just being able to say, here's how many of Airbnbs you've got in your city, here's how many of them are operating full time, and here's what the slope of the graph looks like very, very simple things, provided I think in a lot of cases have really kind of transformed the kind of political process and the policymaking process, because we move from a situation where there's no evidence and the politics is going to happen anyways, to a situation where the political process is going to happen, but it's going to happen on a kind of foundation of evidence. And I think this is the one that I've had the chance to work on. But my suspicion is that there are probably a lot of areas where there's driven by politics, which is good. I mean, I think it's important that people have that there are contestations and disagreements about how our cities should be run, and that we kind of sort those out through the political process. That's very healthy. But my suspicion is that there are probably a fair amount of those where there just isn't a kind of basis of evidence really at all that's feeding into the process, and where kind of coming in not with anything complicated exactly, but just with something kind of simple and systematic, can really just kind of take what is otherwise kind of swaying in the wind and just kind of root it much more solidly. And I'd be happy to kind of expand on that some more. But I mean, that to me, that's a kind of I feel like that's a pretty central role for scientific evidence.
Great, thanks, David. And I think in what you're saying, and a question that comes from our audience, going back to linking what you're saying with what Jenny had mentioned on different types of information. And on not just data, but information that happens on the margins. So maybe it'd be interesting for a minute or two to make a little bit of space for that on information, evidence at the margins, and how we encompass that in the movement. So Jenny, maybe a minute or two on this.
Oh, I was going to say, Marie-Christine, can I just ask one question of David? Because I was really interested in what he had to say. And so, and I wonder, and this is just more of a wondering, okay? We have research, right? Or information that's given to government. And and I think COVID has been a really great example of this. And I struggle with this sometimes, right? We have really quality research that's coming forward about, right, epidemiology, about, the measures that we should be taking for COVID. However, we also have these special interest groups, right, that are doing, I would argue, poor research, right? And they are presenting their quote research, and I'm going to put quotes around it. They're going to provide their research to city council or to decision makers. And I find that, right, the real detriment at the end of the day is not so much the bad research. I guess it's the bad research that now starts raising doubt, right, in our decision makers, right? And so then they don't trust anything. Right. And so we're giving, there's special, and we'll always have these special interest groups that are going to give poor information. COVID, for us, the fluoride conversation as well. And it's raising doubts. And I'm just kind of curious. I just wanted to ask the question when you were talking, like, how do we address that? How do we reconcile that we do have people who are not doing good research? It's based on their ideologies, based on their value system. As I said, I'm struggling with it. And so I wanted to, so I hope it's okay that I just ask this question first before I start talking about the future stuff. Any thoughts about that, David?
Just very briefly, I mean, I think it's an incredibly terrible, like it's a very difficult problem. There's a book called Merchants of Doubt, which came out about a decade ago, talking about how the tobacco industry and then eventually the oil and gas industry, very successfully used this strategy to just to muddy the waters, right? They kind of understood that they're not going to kind of win the scientific debate, but if it looks like it's a debate, then that's enough to actually just say, well, there's doubt about this. It's hard to say. So the book's called Merchants of Doubt. It really makes this point. To me, the big thing here, and another venue where we see this is, there's currently a Canadian academic who is in the midst of having his whole career. It's learned it's based on falsified data. And this person has a very, very prestigious research chair, and all his papers are in the process of being retracted. The whole system is built on trust. And and it's almost impossible to imagine a proper scientific system that isn't just fundamentally based on trust, because peer review is the standard for how we evaluate research, is all trust. You have to trust that people aren't deliberately trying to deceive you. And when you get into the kinds of research that you're talking about, it really is kind of playing a virus into the trust system. Because how I can evaluate that, I can look through the methodology, but that's not a reasonable ask. I think to some extent a well-functioning system is one where academia, via its kind of distributed trust mechanism, can kind of adjudicate these kinds of issues. But when people enter that system with kind of ill intent, it's a just profoundly difficult thing to solve. And I don't think we have any. I think, unfortunately, it's just true that there are not easy solutions to that. And I think what you've identified is kind of one among what I think would be kind of a whole genre of these kinds of problems, unfortunately.
Well, and it's interesting. So thank you, because it is a challenge, I think, in this space. And I was at a conference this week. It was out of Singapore, and it was a Singapore Futures Conference. And one of the researchers there, instructors or professors, I guess, was talking about how actually they have found that the more research or more evidence you provide towards, let's say, the need for a certain policy, actually the more entrenched city council or elected officials become in their own views. So even though you might be providing evidence that counter what their views are, you could be providing it, but it will actually entrench decision makers. And I thought, oh my God, is that what we're dealing with? Are we dealing, how do you reconcile again, or how do you address the fact that actually the people we have in positions of power or in elected positions get more entrenched in their own value system? They refuse to let it go, even though evidence may point otherwise. Anyway, it was just a comment when you were talking. I was thinking, oh my God, this is something that's been on my mind. And in terms of how do we I don't know, how do we address that? So anyway, it's a thought. Sorry, Marie-Christine, I can talk about the future stuff too.
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. And it is it does sound wonderful. We're coming up on time, and so I want to ask a last question and maybe go towards Julie, and then we'll go to our map sharing very soon to get the results and have you comment on that mapping. So in a few minutes, and you're all welcome to join in. And I'm looking at another screen regarding timelines. If we go back to actually logistics of it, sometimes it comes down sometimes to the nitty gritty. do we need to be as strict as we are in the sense that if waiting for research will improve outcomes for urban projects, could the cities wait a few extra weeks, months to allow that research to take place? So, going back, I guess maybe usually to this discussion on how do we work better together. So here is a question of time to have things done. So, how can we look at that?
I think it's a question of time, but also a question of accepting to be open to the science. So you about the discussion just before, we have to put in place, as I said in my introduction, some spaces that are more formal, because if we begin each time to negotiate this discussion, it's difficult. And even for the elected people, we have to put some structure that they are used to and that gives them the scientific information. So I think this will facilitate the transfer of information, and we will lose less time. For example, in some cities, they have installed scientific councils that are like a big structures that can bring many informations from scientists from all disciplines. So this structure is formal, is recognized by the elected officials, and when they need scientific information, they can go back to these structures easily, rapidly, and they know they will have a response, a real good response, and they won't have to search for one researchers and all the ecosystem. So there is some tools that we can put in the cities that facilitate and give more how can I say that the information is more followed by the elected and the civil servants. So I think we have to formalize structures that will help that.
Great. So it's kind of what we call creating a boundary object where everybody agrees on what this object will be and what the rules will be. So that's really, really interesting to look at. So talking about boundary objects, I have my colleague who's the co-director of the collaboratory we have, who is, if all this magic works on the screen, is ready to share his screen to present the map of the results of all of the work that's been done by our viewers, I should say, and participants to the panel. So Jan, if you're with us, we are ready for you to share your screen and see you and hear you about these results.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Marie-Christine. So we've been working in the background for since you all completed the survey that we had on this morning, and so I'm happy to announce that I have now a boundary object that I can present to you. So I'm just going to go through this little presentation, and then we'll have time to discuss the results and these findings. So just for those who joined and maybe weren't there at the very beginning, we've been doing this concept mapping exercise, which consists in ideation and then card sorting, item sorting, and which allows to generate a concept map based on various algorithms, cluster algorithm, and multidimensional scaling. And so we had 20 participants in this exercise, and we had 40 ideas that were generated during the last week. And here we come up with a concept map which presents 4 clusters. We could have a more refined map with more clusters. We can dig deeper, but for today, we're going to present you the map with 4 main ideas. And the question was, in your opinion, to strengthen the link between science and urban public policy, we should. So it was really a question around what could be done to improve science to urban policy. All right, so let's look at what we have. And these are the 4 main themes, the concept map that came out of the work that we collaboratively did this morning. So we've been naming these clusters. And as you see on your left side, the relatively large orange cluster around the idea and notions of shared tools, places, and spaces. And I'll go into more detail to look at some of the items that we find here. The idea of the concept map is that the more people have put two ideas together in a group, the closest they are on the map. And then you have this cluster analysis, of course, which discriminates things that belong together, if I can say. So another cluster that we have here on the red one on top of the map is around adequate and relevant funding schemes. There were a number of ideas expressed here about how we can improve funding to bridge science to urban public policy. The blue cluster on your right is really around awareness and training on both sides, making sure that we understand each other and that there are these bridges and links in terms of knowledge and understanding and language. And finally, and interestingly, there is one item that came out as a unique cluster. I mean, it's an item that didn't belong to any of the other clusters, and it's around the multi-level governance system. So these are maybe an idea that was a little bit more difficult to put with other ideas, and that stands by itself, if I can say. Just very quickly to give you an idea. So each of these items, as you see, correspond to an idea. And so we have around this cluster on shared tools, place and spaces. We're talking about both physical places and spaces where people can be working together, collaborative working spaces, but we're also talking about tools and platforms. For example, a platform to house research syntheses and summaries, as well as a directory of expertise, tools for city on how to work with researchers like guides, results, and so on. All right. The second one, just to give you a little bit more detail here on the adequate and relevant funding schemes, ideas such as having 1% of infrastructure budget set aside for scientific evaluation of impacts on outcomes could be a good idea, but also research funds that support activities specifically geared towards a dialogue between science and experiential knowledge, for example. Here. Our third cluster will give you a little bit more details here, and it's interesting because here there are both training aspects, so both training in municipal settings around what science is and what science can bring, but also, of course, training in academic environments around policy development. But there are also some items here around building more relevant research. So it's interesting to see, and if we go in a finer grained solution with more clusters, we can see that this cluster actually separates into two parts, really the training aspects and then having research that is relevant. And it shows, it's interesting that these are put together. It means that if we train people on each side, it'll also lead to more relevant research projects. And here again, our unique item, but which is from the beginning in the solutions really isolated, the need for clear urban governance systems that give power to cities and city dwellers. And we understand that this is maybe an item that is a little bit outside of what we had talked before. And that is the map. So maybe I will leave the map on here and welcome any comments or questions or suggestions about that. Marie-Christine, I'll give you the microphone back.
Thank you. The floor, the microphone, the screen. Wonderful. Thank you. And I'm happy all of this was possible. The team worked really, really hard behind the scenes. So I guess silent applauses to all. Let's hear our panelists on the concept mapping. Quick, 2 minutes maybe on what you think of this and how this creates any kind of I guess what we would call sense making around the concept, where we're looking at collective intelligence behind this map. Jenny, I see you saying yes.
Yeah. Like, I mean, fortunately, it's really tiny, so like I got my reading glasses on to try to read some of the comments. But I think really interesting information, and I think it's not surprising, when I think about shared tools, and I love that multi-layer. I was actually kind of curious when I saw that multi-layer governance system. I'm like, what does that mean, right? And could that possibly increase bureaucracy, because sometimes we find that, right, with multi-layer governance systems, but I don't know really what that kind of cluster, or that really tiny little cluster, is about. But I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, I couldn't agree more. Of course, adequate and relevant funding sources. I mean, it really does help sustain this work, right? And so when we think about how we move forward, more often than not, right, it's these one-time funding asks, or like, I know from the academic side, the grants, and I wish on the government side, on our side, we would have, I guess I can only speak about the city of Calgary. We do have dedicated staff that do, like, let's say, social research planning, they're involved in it. So we do have, I guess, sustained funding that way. But otherwise, in terms of the connection to the university, we do have the Urban Alliance that really try to connect, but it's still very much a one-time funding a project. And more often than not, I wish we could look at more sustainable, it's actually part of our funding, our regular funding, versus, as I said, for a 1 or 2 2-year projects. So anyway, those are just kind of my initial thoughts, and I'd love to hear from Julie and from
David.
Anyway, just David as well. Yeah. So I just said I'd really like to hear from their perspectives, what they have to say.
Great.
I can go.
David. Oh yeah, Julie, please. Yes, please go ahead, please.
Well, I would say I'm really impressed, and I'm happy to see what I see on the map. So it's really interesting. I think 2 things are important for me. So the shared tools, places and spaces. So I think this is fundamental, because it's a place where we can explain research. So I think there is a misunderstanding in the cities. Not everyone understands very well. So it's really important to inform, give tools like maybe training or session information about research, how it works, why it's important. So this thing, I think, really important. And I see another thing, maybe if you go back to the first one, awareness and training. Yeah, and we didn't talk about something, but I think it's in this exercise. It's about immersion of researchers into the city. So we have seen that this could help a lot, because the researchers can understand how a city works, and it's not easy. So I've been there myself for 4 years, and I don't understand everything yet. So I can understand for a researcher, it's not easy. So maybe formulas like Urban Fellow, we saw that at a city of Toronto. They have a good program of urban fellows within the cities. So it's really interesting, this kind of program, and I think that will help both sides of to make more understanding of 2 realities. So, but all these options and suggestions are really interesting. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. So this thought of mine of boundary objects, boundary peoples, for me seems to be something of an interesting way to go forward, maybe in the development of things. So I'm sharing a few thoughts with you here. David, what's your take on the map?
Yeah, I love it. I think, I mean, something that I think really pops out to me is that when you look at these clusters, we're seeing, like the awareness and training one, for example. I think that there's basically there are a set of things here which boil down to, for people who already, for like the kind of individual actors in the kind of the overall like science policy, like whatever you want to call that kind of, the system, there are things that here that I think kind of point towards people who are kind of already like willing participants, want to be part of this exchange, to do that better, right? And then then I think, like, but then the adequate and relevant funding schemes, to me, seems like it's kind of to some extent doing something different, which is to say it's changing some of the potential underlying kind of rule, like incentives and rules of the system as a whole, to potentially change the set of folks who are interested in participating. Which I think like, and then with the shared tools, places, and spaces, kind of to some extent, I think maybe is kind of bridging those two, where there's it's both going to kind of facilitate newcomers, let's say, as well as kind of make the work of people who are already committed better. But I think that like to some extent there's like a lot of wisdom that emerges out of that, and the sense that we've got to think about both how to like encourage and improve the performance or like the capabilities of the folks who are already trying to do this work. And then on top of that, kind of like, grow the population in general, kind of expand the base of who is potentially, can get involved. So, I mean, to me, that kind of like when I kind of blur my eyes, like that's kind of what I'm seeing in the concept map here, which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah. And so, Jenny, any more thoughts on this mapping exercise that you could link with what you were discussing before on getting to know more what's happening on the margins of this space created potentially between policymakers and researchers?
Oh no, I like great question. Like I was looking at it and I had to copy it over so I could make it a little bit larger for my old eyes to look at. And I kept thinking about like, some of the work we're doing at the City of Calgary, when I think about awareness and training, and we're trying to talk about that there are different types of information that are out there that could inform our policies and, and the work that we do at the city. And, and one of the areas that we've been really focusing on is on futures literacy, right? And so in developing that skill, that practice in our corporation, where there's a practice within futures literacy that's called signal scanning. And signal scanning is really looking at what they call, like things that are happening in parts of the world. It could be in your country, but in like just one small little place, some really interesting innovation that's happening. And it could be, technology, it could be social, political, something that's really interesting that if it became mainstream, it could really be disruptive or could really impact the work that we're doing at the city. And so what, I've been advocating for, even with my students, so like I told in my introduction that I also teach policy with the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. And actually the big piece of work I've been working with my students is how do we start thinking about the future as we not only develop policy, but we, what they call, we test our policies against possible futures. So it's not about predicting the future, but we need to start looking at what's happening. Kind of maybe there's something going on in a corner in the Philippines, for instance, that's really interesting that could really impact the policies, let's say, related to social capital. And you know what? If that became mainstream, that could be really interesting, and it helps us, I know, as city policymakers, to be far more responsive. The problem, I think, is that we're always so slow, right? Academic and government, I think we're ridiculously slow in responding to the true, like we're living in this really ever-changing, fast world, and we are not keeping up. And that's because we're not paying attention to what's going on in the margins, right? We're only paying attention to what, let's say, traditional research is telling us. But I'm not saying that we should ignore that. We should absolutely keep that in mind. But we need to expand our practice where we're thinking about what's going on in the margins, because it's those things that are happening in the margins that we need to pivot, especially in policy, even in terms of research. Like we need to start pivoting a lot faster. And if we start paying attention to what's happening in the margins, it helps us do that. So, as I said, I can talk on forever about this, but I've been really focusing a lot on this with my students, really thinking about how do we become more responsive and more resilient, especially if what happens in the margins become more mainstream.
Yeah, so I guess, again, my theme of boundary objects, because we're creating people and things in places where we can be on or in the margins, and this way of looking at shared tools, places, and spaces, to me seems to be something that is recurring. I guess it's how we put it all together in places, people, and shared areas. Quick word, maybe very quick word, David and Julie, and then we'll move on to conclusion remarks. So a minute, David, maybe on.
I think I have some things I want to say but I'll defer to the conclusion, just because there are a couple extra points that I think would kind of steer us a little away from this. So I'll pass for the sec and come back.
Great.
But I have a question, however, for Jenny,
yes.
maybe.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny, for your thoughts. I think that's quite interesting. The signals and these things that are sort of weak signals, but might be interesting for the future. And trying to link this to this type of exercise here, where we have concept maps, where you have ideas where people can agree on, or you have sort of emerging properties of these ideas where and the question that I was wondering is, how can you optimize your detection of weak signals, knowing that of course it's easy to identify things we all agree on, and maybe through a map like this we can identify some, like the unique cluster that has only one idea, that people they don't know exactly what to do with that, and it's sort of on the margin of the ideas, and how do we grasp that. So my question is, how do you think we can amplify signals, and how do you choose among those signals that potentially make sense and those who don't?
No, great question. So at the City of Calgary, so I'll talk about the City of Calgary and then also what I'm doing in the community as well. So we have a signals club of sorts, right? And so I am part of probably 6 or 7 different signals newsletters. So, the Institute for the Future, the School of International Futures, even the World Economic Forum, they actually have weekly bulletins of signals so they're actually already paying attention to it. So my whole thing is, why reinvent that wheel? I'm already part of, as I said, 6 or 7. And so I get these weekly or every 2 weeks, these bulletins of some really interesting signals, those weak signals that are happening out there. And I really do pay attention to it. And then, at the City of Calgary, we have the Signals Club, where everybody, we have a group of about 20 of us who are also, using different sources to figure out what's going on happening out there that are kind of in the margins. And so we bring that back as a group, right, to discuss, okay, well, which one of these would actually impact our citizen priorities and, our, especially when it comes to government and the services that we provide. So we have that on the go. Now, how do you pick? Well, when I developed the Inclusive Futures Pillar for Resilience, we had probably, over 200-300 signals to kind of play with. And so how do you prioritize to figure out what could inform the work that we were doing? And we actually used a huge matrix, and we looked at signals that, were quite, the ones with the highest uncertainty. So, really not really sure if it's going to happen, but if it did, it would have a huge impact in terms of our city, in terms of, in my situation, building relationships between institutions and community. And we mapped all that out, and the signals that landed in that quadrant, with the most uncertain, that would be the most uncertain, but if it did happen, it would have the biggest impact. And it was based on those signals did we build out the Inclusive Futures Pillar, so that we would be more responsive in case those disruptions happen. And interestingly enough, this happened before the pandemic. And, people, I remember in my group, I had a co-design team of 60 people, believe it or not. And everybody was saying, Jenny, this is never going to happen. This is never going to happen. It's uncertain, but guess what? Right? 3-4 years later, we are now in it. And now I'm having people on my co-design team saying, oh my God, Jenny, we talked about this 3 or 4 years ago, and it's now happening. So it's not about predicting the future, but it's just really about having those kind of creative conversations so that we could be, like I said, more resilient and more responsive. So that's what I did, David. Like,
thanks. Jenny, yeah, thanks. It's really great. And unfortunately, I have to be the keeper of time, and we have 3 minutes left. And I really want to hear you, everybody, on a very short minute on your conclusion remarks. So I'm going to start with Julie. If you can give us a few conclusion remarks, and then we'll go to David and Jenny. Thanks.
So thanks a lot for inviting me. I was really happy to be here. I would say for the end that science, for me, it's not just a nice to have. It should be seen as an essential part of decision making by municipalities. It requires political will. So we didn't talk a lot about that, but I think elected people have to engage in this way, an openness to move in this direction, and also maybe a capacity of researchers to share differently their knowledge. So they have to adapt to the city. So that's my conclusion.
Wonderful. Thank you. David.
I agree with that. I also maybe just I'll make two extremely brief points. One is that I think, fundamentally what we're talking about is politics, which is a question of like, I think often like sincere disagreements driven by material interest. Big decisions that cities make, like any other levels of government, involve situations where they're going to be winners and losers. And I don't think we can kind of, I think science needs to play a role to like help that process work better, as opposed to somehow kind of like sidestep it or something else like that. So for me, I see like, politics as the kind of necessary functioning happening where we contest ideas and priorities. And for me, the most helpful role for science in this process is to provide a kind of foundation for that to work well on. I also just want to note that Margaret Sawatsky asked a question about how could cities push a little bit better on some of these things for scientists to do a better job in terms of kind of getting out of like the kind of publish and perish style of academic research. One small but I think useful idea would be making sure that there are formal channels for kind of recognition that us researchers can go to our deans and our department chairs with and say, look, here is a kind of proof that what I'm doing is having making a positive difference, because fundamentally that's how we have to get by.
Thanks, David. Really quickly, Jenny.
30 seconds. Okay, so I'm going to say that communication. We need to be able to communicate our information in accessible, relatable, understandable ways, with the idea that we have people of different ideologies, different experiences, and knowledge in science. Okay, I did that in 15 seconds.
Great. Thank you. Thanks to all. It was wonderful. Thanks to the team behind the scenes. Thanks to the panelists and the organizers. And we will keep you up to date on this. Cheers. Bye.